Hello students, my name is Ambalika Difosa and I will be taking your history class for class 10. Today we'll be starting a new chapter, chapter 2, which is the First World War. Now, the topic for today will be the effects of imperialism. In the last chapter, we have already discussed about imperialism, colonialism and capitalism, and in today's topic we are going to talk about the effects. So firstly, this process of colonialism and imperialism highly enriched the political, social and cultural life of the imperial powers on one hand, but on the other hand it highly impoverished the colonies, because the colonies were merely surviving as supplier for raw materials for the industries of the imperialist and colonial countries, and at the same time they were also surviving as a market for the finished goods and products. The trade and commerce, the education, be it the public health, agriculture, etc., all these sectors were lying in a state of stagnation, complete stagnation in these colonies. But on the other hand, the imperialist countries, the big countries, big powers like England, France, Germany, they were benefiting a lot from this process, from this system of colonialism. Now, we can basically, the colonies were merely an exporter of raw materials, and at the same time they were also an importer of the finished goods. So next point is, apart from enriching the imperialist countries, this system also gave birth to fierce competition, fierce rivalry, you can say, between the colonial powers, because the higher the number of colonies you have, it means the higher number of raw materials you're going to get for your industries, and at the same time you're also getting the markets for your finished goods, which in turn leads to more wealth for your country. So there was a fierce competition between the various imperial powers like England and Germany and Russia for the possession and repossession of these colonies. This colonial rivalry at the same time also led to a kind of a mad race for military preparedness, and there was also a kind of a suspicion and jealousy also among the nations of Europe, especially the nations of Western Europe in the 18th and the 19th centuries. So war came to be treated as the only means for the solution for all these problems. Now, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, there came more industries in all these countries. Now, with the spread of Industrial Revolution, most of the nations of Europe, they began to launch their own career for colonial possession, as in who would gain more colonies in the Pacific region, or maybe in the Balkan Peninsula, in all the regions. They were vying with one another for the supremacy, for colonial possession. Apart from this rivalry, there was also the emergence of the notion of the idea of national pride and prestige, which gave a new dimension to this already existing colonial rivalry. Now, there were many kind of rivalries. The significant ones were like the Anglo-French rivalries in India and Egypt, and then we have the Anglo-German rivalry in South Africa. Likewise, there were many other rivalries between the nations, especially between Britain and Germany. This colonial expansion, this trend of expanding the colonies in Europe had reached its climax, had reached its extreme point in the year 1870 to 1914, between this year. And proportionately, in the same year, the rivalry for the colonies had also been increasing, had also been maximizing. Now, in the Pacific region, what happened is that the countries like Germany, Holland, Japan, and at the same time, the USA. The USA was now emerging as a very powerful colonial power, colonial imperialist power. So these countries were fighting with one another. There was a fierce competition between them for the supremacy in the Pacific region, as in who would have the power, who would have the supreme power in the Pacific region, since the Pacific region occupied a very important position in terms of colonies. Now, in the like manner, this competition, this fierce competition was also seen among the countries of Latin America and Central America. Nextly, talk about the Ottoman Empire. Now, the countries of the Danube Valley, also known as the Balkan, which falls under the Balkan Peninsula. Now, these smaller countries of the Balkan Peninsula earlier belonged to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was earlier under the Turkish rule. Now, the countries of the Balkan Peninsula, they did not want to remain under the Ottoman Empire anymore. They wanted to become independent as nation states. But now this idea was not supported again by the European big powers like England and France. They did not want them to become independent. Why? Because they wanted these smaller countries to be under them. They wanted to establish their supremacy over them. So these countries would vie with one another for their unitary and individual hegemony over this region. So time and again we could see that there was political and military intervention in this region from one power or the another. So you can say that the Balkan Peninsula was a trouble spot, was a breeding trouble spot for the First World War, and you can also compare it to sleeping volcano which was getting ready to erupt at any time, which ultimately led to the outbreak of the First World War. So you can see that the desire of the nation states, of the smaller countries to become nation states, to become independent on one hand, and on the other, the protest against the European big powers to not give them independence, to keep them under their control, was one important factor for the outbreak of the First World War. Now, why was this Ottoman Empire important? Now, the countries of the Balkan Peninsula, the smaller countries of the Balkan Peninsula, were earlier under the Ottoman Empire of the Turkish rule. But after the fall and decline of the Khalifa of Turkey, these smaller countries of the Balkan Peninsula did not want to remain the Ottoman Empire anymore. They had been subjected and exploited for a very long time under the Ottoman Empire, that is under the Turkish rule. But after the decline of their power, they wanted to assert their independence. They wanted to become independent as nation states. But however, this idea was not supported by the big European powers, because they in turn wanted these countries, these smaller countries under them, they wanted to subject them to their authority. They wanted to bring their supremacy over this Balkan Peninsula and bring them under their control, and so they did not support their new assertion of becoming independent nation states. So this Balkan Peninsula became a trouble spot for a very long time, which ultimately led to the outbreak of the First World War. And you can say that the Balkan Peninsula was, it can be compared to sleeping volcano. Like, it was getting ready to erupt at any time. So much was the trouble in the Balkan Peninsula. So the desire of the imperial powers, the big European powers, to bring supremacy over the Balkan Peninsula, to bring them under the control and domination on one hand, and on the other, their desire to become independent ultimately led to the outbreak of the First World War. Now, moving ahead to the next topic, which is the causes of the First World War. Now, in Europe, there were many countries like Germany and Italy, which became a nation state at a later stage as compared to the countries like England and France. So as a result, there emerged a new kind of rivalry. That is the rivalry between the old imperial powers and the new imperial powers. Old imperial powers as in England and France, and then the new imperial powers like the new nation states like Germany and Italy, which had recently become new nations. So there began a new kind of rivalry between the old imperial powers and the new imperial powers. After the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, there was a brief period of, you can see, peace from the period 1815 to 1914, that is almost a century. But of course, there were some localized wars which were of shorter duration, not for a long time, just for example 1 year, 2 year, these small wars which were of shorter duration, which disturbed the peace of Europe time and again. For example, we have the Crimean War, which occurred in 1854 to 56, that is for 2 years, and then we have the Austro-Prussian War, which occurred in 1866. But these localized wars in Europe was nothing in comparison to the First World War, because the First World War, it lasted for about 1565 days. It started in the year 1914 and it ended in the year 1918. So you can say it lasted for about 4 years, so approximately 1565 days. And this First World War was fought in like in all forms, as in like it was fought in land, it was fought in air, and it was fought in water. Tanks, then poisonous gas, submarines, planes, all of them were used in this war for the first time in human history. Earlier, tanks, poisonous gas, they were not used at all. Even submarines were used in this war. Now, the number of casualties in the First World War was also extremely high, because over 65 million soldiers were killed in this war alone. And besides that, million others, 50 million, more than 50 million, millions of people were injured. And those who were not directly involved in this war were also affected. Altogether, you can say 29 countries were directly involved in the First World War. And then apart from these 29 countries, 31 other countries were also indirectly involved in this war. The people had to suffer a lot because of this war. It was the first kind in the human history of a war of such a major scale. Now let's talk in brief about the general causes of the First World War. Let us know the points first. In brief, let us know the points. So firstly, it was obviously the aggressive policy of the imperial powers for the possession of colonies. There was a competition between the imperial powers as into who would gain more colonies. Secondly, there was this growth of military alliances, secret military alliances between the countries in Europe, especially before the outbreak of the war. And then there was also this mad race for military and defense preparedness, as in there was a lot of preparation in terms of military and defense of the country. Fourthly, there was obviously the emergence of jealousy and suspicion among the countries of Europe. No countries trusted one another. There was always this suspicion among one another, as in who has prepared more in terms of military, in terms of defense. Now, fifthly, there was the spread of aggressive nationalism, or you could say national pride and prestige, which developed among the people, especially the national ideology, the sentiment which occurred in the French Revolution inspired the people a lot. And then sixthly, and the most important, the desire of the oppressed, as in the exploited countries, the smaller countries, to become independent. So these are in brief the various causes of the First World War.